Thank you everyone for coming here today. And first of all, I'd like to thank the UMBC and the Office of Undergraduate Education for allowing me this opportunity. This has been a fantastic opportunity for me to expand upon my major and broaden my horizons in my own culture as well. It is difficult in this day and time, and more importantly in this place, to fully comprehend another world existing that is barred from freedom of expression, of choice, or of personal identity. These are all important qualities that fuel the uniqueness within individual works and that distinguish cultural identity. As an English major, I wanted to further explore the idea of literature becoming a synthetic reflection on society. Being Albanian, I found this an opportunity to not only better understand the trials of communist censorship on literature, but also broaden my understanding of the brutal communist system my family knew well of. How did communism affect the everyday lives of people? In what ways did it demand exceptional individuality, and how? How did severe censorship affect the way people think? As these questions began forming in my mind, my thesis became clear. I wanted to understand how censorship affected the progression of Albanian literature and in what ways it did so. More specifically, I believe that communism stunted Albania's literary movement and halted any sign of progression. To accomplish this, I wanted to actually go to Albania, and I did just that in the summer of 2008. By retrieving copies of Albania's then literary magazine, Nëndori, as well as commentary and articles from the national newspaper, Drita, I became enlightened as to what was required for literature to be considered good or appropriate by communist standards. The list for this criteria wasn't long. Such requirements were relevance to the modern time, popular theme that appeals to the masses, and no personal reflection whatsoever. While reading article after article in dusty library rooms about how literature should strengthen comradeship, I realized that the beautiful irony in this theory came in the form of the notable Albanian author Ismail Kadare. In his book, Broken April, Kadare writes, "At last he had the conviction that he would never go anywhere but in the wrong direction, to the very end of the handful of days that was left to him." Though this memorable line is the destiny for the protagonist of the novel, it parallels greatly to Kadare's destiny within the literary world and his reputation both inside and outside of Albania's borders. My goal became to dissect Kadare's books and understand in what ways his writing is rebellious writing. I focused a great deal on 3 of his books, The Pyramid, The Palace of Dreams, and Agamemnon's Daughter. While the first 2 were both published within Albania, Agamemnon's Daughter is one of the few that was smuggled in unfinished pieces outside of the country, and I'll discuss shortly why. Kadare's popularity seeps into every urban and rural corner of Albania. He is considered as one of the national heroes for his accomplishments in literature. This became more evident outside of the borders with his nominations for the Nobel Prize and his winning of the Man Booker International Prize in Literature in 2005. Kadare has stated that dictatorship and authentic literature are incompatible. The writer is the natural enemy of dictatorship, and it couldn't be more true. The Pyramid is perhaps one of the most notable works against communism. Taking place in Egypt, in a world that parallels Kadare's time in Albania, the pharaoh Cheops decides to invest all of his time and the kingdom's time into building him the greatest pyramid ever to harbor his body after death. The unequivocal style he writes in fuels strong feelings of anti-communism. For example, the intentional use of specific words in order to enhance the book's connection to Albania is made apparent within the beginning of the first chapter when discussing Cheops' act to destroy religion. Atheism is simply another facet into which the dictator could dominate a central point of everyone's lives. A strong belief of Karl Marx was that religion is a draining and insignificant aspect of a person's life, and much like capitalism, an individual will submit his or her life to the worship of God and yet receive nothing in return. Kadare writes within the Pyramid, had he not had 2 of Egypt's most ancient temples closed down just a few weeks before, and then ordered the posting of a decree that forbade Egyptians to indulge henceforth in sacrificial practices? While the majority of the book's language adheres to ancient Egypt, Kadare flavors the book with modern concepts, such as the word hell, rather than, for example, the afterlife. These slight shifts are completely intentional and remind the reader that they are not reading a book solely about Egypt. As Kadara stated in a personal interview with him on July 30th, 2008, I did this on purpose, choosing such words, to show that this book is firstly about communism and oppression, and then a story about Egypt. This method is one that stretches throughout the book, ensuring that each image paints the portrait of a poisonous government plays the double role of fitting neatly into the storyline, as well as the capability to be intertwined with modern-day Albania. In the passage I just read, for example, the term sacrificial practice bleeds into the communist idea that religious practice should be fervently banned, particularly because it gave independent power and imagination to people. Further in the book, Kadara describes the creation of writing and how it is received by the high Egyptian officials. Sorry about that. In the book, he writes, evil signs had been discovered in this country that was called writing. Apparently, these lines and dots had the power to mummify the thoughts of men, just as bodies could be embalmed. From that day on, a policeman was on duty outside the Sumerian embassy. Barely did the spy see wisps of smoke rising above, he ran to give the alarm, a report. Yet again, one can see the insertion of the words embassy and policeman, a clear nod to the modern form of government. The pyramid is a euphemism for the laborious work done by Albanians during the communist period, and by Kadara stressing the countless deaths caused by the building of Cheops's pyramid. He ends the pyramid with the insertion of a section called skull stacks, and that part of the book discusses the building of Timberland's pyramid that was created from human skulls. And this is a much more literal interpretation of people giving their lives to build a meaningless edifice. In it, Kadara writes of the pyramid and how everyone had to give their lives, willingly or unwillingly, it was taken from them in order to build it. And it shadows Cheops's pyramid as a shadow of tyranny and death. In the interview, Kadara states, I wanted to show that much like the bunkers being built all over Albania, Egypt had the pyramids. They required great energy, a lot of money, and kept the people tired. In his most daring book, Agamemnon's Daughter, Kadara doesn't hide behind the allegories or symbolism. His novella about a young couple whose romance is dictated by politics and political affiliation, it alludes to the classic story of Agamemnon's sacrifice of his daughter. The book openly criticizes the interference of communism in every aspect of people's lives. Kadara himself has stated that spiritual and emotional sacrifice that people made was perhaps even more devastating than the physical one. Perhaps that is why he wrote it in as it was in reality, as opposed to having it hide behind allegories and symbolism as he did with most of his other works. Another aspect that I tried to focus on with my research was the underground writing from authors who were never actually published. And there were a lot of authors who wrote their own manuscripts, who kept them hidden at all times in fear of being persecuted for them. And most works that actually were published were obviously gone under immense criticism, immense censorship, to try and display what ideals communism wanted to put forth to the population. And one of the stories that I wanted to touch on briefly was the one of Havzi Nera. And he was in the mid-1900s. He was caught trying to escape Albania into a nearby country, and after he was taken in, he was imprisoned for 10 years of his life. And while he was in prison, he wrote many of his own poetry that bashed communism and criticized it heavily, and how it has stunted Albania's cultural growth, its cultural uniqueness, and how everybody had been blended together and everything had become generic. After the poetry was discovered, he was hanged, and he wasn't mentioned ever again. His poetry was never studied until this summer when I was in Albania in 2008, where his case was reopened and studied, and some of his poetry was published for the first time ever. And this is something that we like to refer to in Albania now as black market writing. I will wrap it up here, and I just wanted to say that this was a fantastic opportunity for me to go and learn more about my own culture in a field that I am highly interested in. And this could not have been done without the help of Professor Falco, who guided me along the way. And it was something that I will greatly treasure and something that I continue to expand upon in the future. Thank you.
Maybe a couple of questions, if anybody has questions.
Yes.
Nikoletta, I enjoyed your presentation very much. In your conversation with Kadare, or perhaps with younger Albanian writers, didn't you get a sense of Kadare as a perhaps more controversial figure, someone who is seen by some as a radical and a polemical, almost dissident writer on the one hand, but others see him as someone who, after all, has been able to publish all these books and receive all these literary honors during the communist regime. So did you get a sense of Kadare as a controversial writer?
Definitely. It's something that we didn't dwell on too much, but he, back in the time when he was in Albania, he splits his time now between France and Albania, and even back then, he was one of the few who was able to leave the country. He was on good terms with the dictator. But the country was split between people who were hardcore communists and people who did not believe in communism at all. And that's where the controversy came in. There were a lot of people who did consider him a radical figure and did not agree with his works. They questioned his patriotism to Albania, because in order to be a patriot, you had to be a communist and you had to agree with communism, and that was always an issue. Today, generally, because of his accomplishments and because he is one of the few who has brought recognition to Albania, he is seen as pretty much a legend and a hero. Any more questions?
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.